Welcome, everyone. My name is Mick Kennedy of Bass Clef Books. We started Bass Clef Books a couple of years ago in 2022, and I've been looking forward to working with Libby on one of her books, and we finally got together on that. It's really an honor to have her reading tonight in celebration of Women's History Month. I've known Libby for quite a few years now, mainly through her support of the Heartland Review, which is another journal that I edit out of ECTC in Elizabethtown, Kentucky. And in fact, she's been pretty successful publishing poems in several issues and even winning a few prizes along the way. Along with her wonderful poetry, Libby is a true advocate of creative writing, having been and continuing to be in many respects a teacher, a guide, an inspiration, advisor to many. And as I said, working with Libby on her collected works was certainly a great experience for me and a great addition to the list of publications from Bass Clef Books. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, Libby Falk Jones.
Thank you so much, Mick. It is a great honor to work with you, to work with poetry, and to be here tonight. And I really want to thank everybody who is with us tonight. Want to jump in and start out with a poem. It's called For Your Good Health, Drink Flowers. Swallow poppies, lanky pink petals flapping. Gulp orange hibiscus. Let red stamen twist around your tongue. Touch your tongue the orchids, dancing purple, tigerish. Sip a succulent yellow pear blossom. Season your milkshake with anemones bubbling from a silver faucet. Lick the last drops of violet foxglove from your fingers. For a midnight nightcap in moonlight, seize a white Sirius. This poem came from an imaginative idea about drinking flowers, and it gave me a chance really to play and particularly to do the word play and sound, to put words together. And I'd like to think that that is a kind of hallmark of all of my writing. And I'm grateful to Mick for suggesting that the title of this poem would make a good one for a book. And I very much appreciate his support, and his book design, I think, is quite lovely. So what I'd like to do is say a little bit about the book and its organization. I'll end up reading about 9 poems, I believe. There are 3 sections in the book, and I want to on those, and then talk also a little bit about some of the traditional forms that I've used in writing poetry. So these poems come from the past 4 decades. I've always been a reader and writer, but I'm a latecomer, as it were, to poetry, beginning in around the 1980s and taking a big jump forward in the early 2000s when I had my first sabbatical and discovered that when I had a whole lot of unstructured time, what I really wanted to do was to write poems. By then, of course, I had studied poems, studied poetry writing with some really amazing teachers, one of whom is here tonight, Katerina Stoikova, and also then had begun teaching poetry writing, which, as every teacher knows, is a wonderful way to learn. So the first section of the book is the poems from my first chapbook, Above the Eastern Treetops Blue, which was published in 2010 from Finishing Line Press. Many of these poems are contemplative. I put the collection together after teaching my first contemplative writing course in the winter of 2009. In fact, the working title of the manuscript was Abundance. So I'd like to read a couple of poems from that. For my first son, turning 20, I did not understand that you'd grow up. I could not see you muscled, your father's face, my husky voice, your legs that drew up in the bath, now stretching miles in minutes. I did not know your fingers turning pages one by one would flow across the keyboard, making poems. My mother knew, who braced you on her shoulder to tour the yard, absorb the leaf, branch, cloud, sky. I'm happy with my immortality, she told me, spooning you her special stew. I did not grasp the chain, your forward motion rounding out my life, my son the runner, my son the writer, my son the explorer, my son the man. That first contemplative writing class spent time in the desert. This poem is called Desert Rising. If an angel is to come to me, I think it would have to happen in this landscape where saguaros beckon, arms crossed in promise, and flat, prickly pear discs witness the wraparound dawn. It would have to be between the three sharp bird trills and the rabbit's soundless scurry, flash of a lizard under mesquite and palo verde. Yes, it could happen among these rocks, knuckles of red gneiss edging the dry wash. Under my feet, a mosaic of small stones luminous. Those could be her fingers, those streaks of pink and gold, waving to wands of ocatilla, grazing cholla spines on my upturned face, coming to rest. The second section of the book includes poems that were part of a collection that I co-authored with four other Berea poets, Vicki Hayes, Tina Parker, Dorothy Schneer, and Barbara Wade. Our book was called Balance of Five. It was published in 2015, and we organized it around different themes so that each section of that book included poems by each of us where our voices could speak to one another. So in a way, I didn't see fully what my part of that book was like until I gathered these poems to go into this book. And when I did do that, I could see that they explored experiences of loss and also of promise. Darkened light for my father. Your face at the Cleome blossom I bring you from your garden, my one trip out of your hospital room, bewildered. Those seeds you smuggled in from Canada, flower you showed off to friends. When I pull back the curtain to let in the light, you turn your face away. No grow light in the garage to sprout these seeds. In your water glass, the Cleome quivers purple. A strange flower, who could have invented it? That mirror of the universe. Empty its darkness into your pockets to amaze the natives in your new world. Record February. Thinking the old cat may not last until summer, I invite him to my lap, smooth back his brows until each breath's a purr. He doesn't mind the microphone. I scratch, he purrs. When he's wheezed to silence, I hit rewind, then press play. A serenade swells forth, a roar loud as katydids, rhythmic as raindrops, inexorable as the attic fan. This poem is about a different kind of loss. Celebrating 50 by throwing out my makeup. For 40 years, I've kept my beauty in a drawer. Private stock brandy and the wine for lips. Thin curved Maybelline gripper with replacement rubber to squeeze out lashes like spider's feet. A jar of smoothing cream, bottled wood hue, puzzling pot of black, countless brushes. They clatter in the can. This next half century, I'll shampoo and set bike helmet, rub in running headband, smooth my arms with Tai Chi on the beach, let inner glow suffice. In the third section of the book, there are poems that have been written over the last 40 years and have been published individually in various journals and anthologies. They explore a variety of human and natural environments. And in this first poem, you will realize was written at an earlier period than the Turning 50 poem. It's called Today at the Plumbing Store Counter. I put on my lipstick. Around me, men, heavy jowls, hairy arms, speak of plastic parts and female ends. In the circle of my compact, my lips glare and oh. That poem is special to me. It's actually the first poem of mine that was ever published. And then it was included in the wonderful anthology that Katerina Stoikova put together of short poems. Turning then to a natural environment, this poem is called On the Mountain, August. You don't need to come here unless you love blue mushrooms shining in dark leaves, blueberry bushes standing tall, the hum of hornets. You don't need to come here unless you love silence and rain, love the whip of wet grasses on your bare legs, love drinking water from a hidden spring. You don't need to come here unless you love dark nights where your inner eye opens and you dream in all the color of wildflowers. You don't need to come here unless you love yourself and your forebears and family who've made you, whom you make new. You don't need to come here unless you love time, want to fill your blueberry pail with minutes, never pick them all. Finally, I'd like to read a couple of examples of different poetic forms that I've worked in. As you know, many of you are poets. You know that every poem has a form in open form or free verse. We work to find the form that poem calls for. Every form is unique, but I've also found it stimulating to write in traditional forms. It's both challenging, but also generative, since you have some rules that you want to try to follow. Sometimes the traditional form for me will be a deliberate effort. I'll say, I would like to write a pantoum or a villanelle. And so I'll work to find the material that would fit those forms. But often it's more that I begin writing, and as material comes forth, I sense that it could call for a sonnet. And in fact, an early poem that I read for my first son turning 20, that poem is a blank verse sonnet. It's the form of a sonnet with the line length, the rhythm of a sonnet. It's blank verse because it doesn't have rhyme. And in that particular poem, called me to the sonnet from the very get-go because that first line was what came into my head. I did not understand that you'd grow up. 5 stresses, it was right for a sonnet. So I began to explore material and to see if it would work well in that form. There are actually 7 traditional forms that are included in this book. I've included a sonnets, villanelle, pantoum, haiku, cinquain, sestina, and ghazal. And I would have loved to read my sestina. It had the honor of winning a couple of years ago the Joy Bale Boone Poetry Prize, which is a great, great honor. It's a pretty long poem, so I thought I'd save that one, let you read that for yourself. But I would like to share 2 other poems in traditional forms, and these both were published in the Heartland Review. The first one is a pantoum titled Flight. And if you know that form, both the poems that I'm reading in traditional form here, pantoum, and then I'll read a villanelle, both of them depend on repeating lines. So in the pantoum, you will hear some lines coming back, but it's permissible to alter them a little bit when they reappear, so you won't hear exact repeats. Flight. I've been there once or twice, about 1,000 feet above the fields and farms and hills of East Kentucky, where wind whirs outside the cockpit window and the plane dips its wings in homage to the land. Above the hills and farms and fields of East Kentucky, sometimes flocks of snow geese honk and clatter, dipping their wings toward land as I stand watching, my wishes drifting skyward like cumulus clouds. Sometimes I hear geese flapping and honking. How small I must seem to them, a strange sort of tree whose wishes drift skyward to weave among the clouds. In their eyes, only patterns of water, light, earth. How small and strange I must seem, a milkweed exploded. If they have eyes beyond wings' rhythms, winds were, for the patterns, shadows beneath them. With them, I've been there, up there, more than 1,000 feet. This poem came about after an airplane ride that my husband, who is a pilot, had taken me, and the recurring lines seem to suggest the experience of uniting the different elements of sky, bird, earth, and viewer. And my villanelle is that I'm going to read. I actually have 3 villanelles in this collection. It's really a poem about writing villanelles. People say that you have to be somewhat obsessive in order to write a villanelle because the poem is only 19 lines long, and of those there are 2 different lines that each repeat 4 times. And so you've really got to be willing to return and return again to your material. So I was thinking about the obsession that's reflected in villanelles and how the lines kind of dance to each other. And I got the idea of writing a villanelle that would be a dance. So again, you can listen for repeated lines, some of which shift a very little bit. Dancing villanelle. My first line needs a partner. What to do? Obsession's key, or so the experts say. Monsieur, may I have this dance with you? Perhaps we'll choose a waltz, a rhythm true. It helps to relish words, to love to play. My first line needs a partner. What to do? My mama loved to foxtrot, daddy too. Take one line at a time, you'll make your way. Madame, may I have this dance with you? a rumba or a tango. Yes, those two. Oh, it's so hard to find the words to say. My first line needs a partner. What to do? Two left feet, but still you can dance true. Return, return again, this time to stay. Mamselle, may I have this dance with you? Turns out I like to villa dance. Who knew? I think I just could write like this all day. My first lines found a partner. We can do, monsieur. Merci. Now, au revoir to you. That was a lot of fun to write. Right. Well, I hope that this has given you a sampling of a flavor of the drinks that this collection offers. I would love to hear from anyone with comments or questions about these poems or poetry writing in general.
Yes, does anybody have any questions for Libby? Yes, Carolyn?
Hi, it was so great to hear your words and your work tonight. I was just wondering two things. Did you uh, sort of realize how often you referenced like flowers or that kind of floral imagery before you arrived at the? Did you organize your reading around that, or did that just sort of happen spontaneously? And then my other question is more of a like poetic life question, which is it was really striking to me, kind of at the beginning of wanting to do this work for a very long time, uh, how your work spanned so much time, like how you managed to keep writing throughout different seasons of your life. And I just was wondering how you did that.
Whoa. Okay, two great questions, Carolyn, and thank you so much. That is interesting. I haven't actually tracked flowers in particular. I certainly draw a great deal on the natural world. So, it's not surprising to me that those would work in. Again, it was Mick had, read what I was offering as a manuscript, and I asked him for suggestions for a title, and he lighted on this one, and I really liked that because it had been a playful poem. It certainly wasn't one of the poems that I thought about a whole lot, but I thought, and I love it that I'm trying to, it's a kind of argument, that if we could drink more flowers, we would be healthy. And I really loved that idea. And it felt to me like that kind of included the family, the lifespan, the natural world, the contemplation, and so on. So, yeah, so I think that it's kind of a happy accident. Maybe should say it that way. But I thought that the cover design I began, as many of you know, I do also do photography. So of course I actually photograph flowers quite a lot. So I've looked at them very carefully in the rain and the sun and lots of different light. And I was very happy that Mick thought we could use one of my photographs on the cover. And I think his design is really awesome. So yeah, so lifespan. Well, I think if you're a writer, poetry is probably the very best genre that you could latch on to because it's the world. I mean, so much is possible. It has much greater variety, I think, than any single other genre like the short story, or the essay. Both of those are longer forms. And one of the reasons I turned to poetry in the 1980s was that I wanted to write and I had two small children. So writing a 20-page short story was kind of not going to happen. But I could sit on my sofa, and capture a moment. I mean, the poem at the plumbing store counter kind of wrote itself. I mean, when I stood there with my round compact and my round lips in there and realized I was a woman doing this in this very masculine place, I thought I had something and I just needed to find a way to get that on the page. So I think that, and poems are also, again, because of the relative smallness and the intensity, you know, you can start something and let it sit and then come back to it and work with it again. And many of these poems I have worked with and revised over a number of years before feeling that I had them to, you know, the place that I wanted them. And I guess the other, every type of writing has its challenges, but as I studied with poets, read more poetry, saw what students were writing, you know, I got new ideas about poems and things that I wanted to try. I had I didn't know much about ghazals and had never tried writing one, but then I had the opportunity to teach poetry writing in Turkey in the Keys through the Keys program. And well, if I'm teaching creative writing, you know, we want to use a form that's appropriate to the culture that we are studying in and living in. So, you know, I looked up and found out something about ghazals and, you know, so then tried my hand at writing those. So I guess I would say, you know, keep on and know that you can live into work as a poet. And as your voice changes, as your perspective changes, new opportunities in poetry will open to you. And that's, I think, a very exciting thing about being a writer, and one way that poetry is a true gift. Thank you for those questions.
Mary Elizabeth Moore had her hand up.
Hi, Mary Elizabeth.
Can you hear me? Actually, I
Yes.
didn't have my hand up. I saw a sign appear on the screen about lower your hand, so I clicked on the button and raised it instead of lowering it. But Libby, I'm fascinated by. I love your poetry, and
Thank
one
you.
of the things that fascinates me about the collection, this collection, and the poems that you chose to read tonight, is the way in which they represent so many different forms and images, and they, but not in an artificial forced way. They complement one another. The more serious poem about your son and the playful poems are part of a whole. So I would love to hear you speak to the ways in which poems within this collection complement or highlight or add meaning to one another.
Okay, again, that's a wonderful question, and you know, the art of there is an art in putting together a collection, and I'm still working with that and learning it. Again, Katerina Stoikova has been a tremendous guide with helping to think about ways that poems can speak to one another, and that happened with the poems in my first chapbook. That structure actually was helped along by a former student of mine who came back to visit Berea at the time that I was organizing that manuscript. And I had done it in a pretty predictable way. That is, I had several poems about my son and my husband and my parents, and then I had some desert poems and so on. And I had, you know, kind of grouped them by similar topic. And he sat down with the 25 pages and read through them and walked back up to me and said, you know, there's a narrative here and you've missed it. So I said, okay. He happened to be a fiction writer, so he saw things differently and he shuffled around and created a different order. And when I saw what he did, I realized that he had gone for deeper kinds of connections through image and voice rather than chronology or subject. So I've tried in the years since then to bring that to my own thinking about putting poems together, wanting some variety, but also some resonance as they speak to one another. And I know there are poets, Richard Taylor, you know, whose work I admire so hugely and to whom I'm so grateful for writing such generous words about this collection. He has two collections of poems yes, collections of poems that are all sonnets. So he can write an entire full-length collection where every poem is a sonnet. And I've never tried to do that. I like prefer the variety and letting sort of things mesh together, but I can see how that's an interesting challenge to do, to pick a genre that you are drawn, a form rather, that you're drawn to, and then try to, see how many poems you could do, because then you begin to explore the nuances. I'm thinking Carolyn Grace, who's here, who is a brilliant writer of sonnets, deconstructed sonnets, and she plays different music on every sonnet that she writes. I think her book, which is coming out this next month, must have 20 or 30 different sonnets among the collection, and they are all, none is a repeat of the other. So this is a rambling answer, but I do think that it's reading aloud and listening for voice and mood, and and also something about the way poems look on the page. There are skinny poems, and then there are longer line poems, and white space is a crucial part. Silence is a crucial part of poetry. The line break is a moment of silence. And when I read, I try to honor that tiny line break that is at the end of every line, even if it's not a natural stopping point. So it's you're very much a visual and auditory artist when you're working with poetry, and that is another reason why I think it's such a joyful and stimulating genre to work with as a writer.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Let's see, Taylor, you mentioned about my work and style. Taylor, did you have something in particular that was on your mind that you wanted to ask about?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I was like, I'm just not good at questions. I'm always the bad one at questions, but always I'm good at listening. But it really kind of like just touched me because like how you just we photo flowers and stuff. Because I do remember a time like when my great grandmother just always read poems, but it's been so long, and so like kind of like made me remember poems and like how like the flowers and like the colors you mentioned just kind of come in like a vibrant, happy style, which we all need in the world right now because the world out there is like crazy with everything going on. But I don't have any questions, but I have like loved your style tonight, and it's kind of opened me to like look more into your style. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That's I told Mick earlier today my vivid memory of an in-person reading in 2019 that I was able to do in E-Town on campus in that wonderful art gallery. In fact, I read the Pantoum Flight and the Dancing Villanelle at that time, and a number of Mick's students were there, and I was so impressed. They read as well, and then we had dialogue about poetry and writing. So, and you have, definitely are part of that tradition, because listening to one another and having ideas sparked from even an image or a word or a line that you hear in somebody else's poem. I love that. That's another reason I enjoy keeping on with poetry and working with other writers. I always have paper in front of me. I'm shameless in stealing images and lines from other people. So I think that's actually, it's the greatest honor, right? To have something stolen from you because somebody so loved the word or the image or the line that they want to make it part of their work as well. So I hope you'll keep up with your writing, and we'll experiment with trying some new things. Okay. Is that Susan who wants to speak, or?
Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi,
Okay.
Susan.
Well, I'm glad to be here. And I want to say two things. One, that I love the the I don't I know there's a term for this, but just the moment, just the moment that you capture that can seem so simple, but yet have layers of meaning as one rereads the poem and rereads the poem. It can relate to many different things. And I also want to say that I love hearing you read your poems because your voice and your enthusiasm and the joy and the emotion that you put in the poems, I believe brings a greater depth to that. So since I've heard you read several poems, now when I look at your poems on the page, I can almost hear your voice and hear your enunciation and hear your emotion attached to it. And I think that brings another level, another depth to the words on the page.
Great. Thanks so
So
much, Susan. Yeah, and I mean, poetry is voice on the page. So I do read works aloud. I read every poem aloud and I read lines aloud. And when I'm playing with line breaks or word changes, I'm hearing the words or reading them aloud. So I think that's a crucial element of a poem. And you often can, you can read it aloud and you'll know right away what things are really working and what can be changed. And I do love that with poems, they are small enough usually that you can really, afford to take time with them. And a single word change can make such a big difference in a poem. And so you can work with those small units and play music, as it were, or work with the images and intensify, um, the things that are there. And I've also worked at learning to let go of things, to cutting out, learning to use the silence, learning that less is more. That because, as you can tell, I love words and I swim in them. But with poems, I've learned to step back and to see where space or silence can do the job, or where the single image may carry it rather than trying to say it three different ways. So, learning silence, I think my contemplative work has been a big help in doing that. But learning when to stop, when to take away, in order to, to sculpt the poem, to create the more layers, and then to take away the things that might distract, so that the the beauty of it shines through. I think we're always after that, and it's an endless process. And when I'm happy that I can say, I certainly can't say that every poem I've ever written is great or needed to be pursued, but to have some poems that now I've lived with for years, and I can read and keep in my mind as things of feeling and beauty and knowledge and experience. That's a great thrill to me, and I know it is. Again, you're here because you're writers, and I know you've had that experience as well.
Linda Wilson had a question.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it wasn't so much a question, Libby, but I so enjoyed all of the poems, and I just wanted to touch on what I think it was Susan, the previous comment about how taking something so simple and describing it in such a beautiful way is really a very special thing. And it reminded me, I'm currently taking a Coursera course, one of these free online courses that's supposed to be the most popular course at Yale University about happiness. And anyway, one of the exercises that the instructor is asking the students to do to cultivate happiness is savoring, like really noticing very special moments and taking time to savor. This is probably part of your contemplative work, but to me, what you're doing in some of these poems is savoring and helping us to savor some of what might be an ordinary experience we sometimes forget. So thank you for that.
And thank you for that comment. I'm flattered. And yes, I would. I think that artists, visual artists, writers, uh, it is a process of drawing. It's a question of what you pay attention to, and to be able to pay attention to some things that are large and some things that are tiny, but to be in that moment. I mean, the act of writing, I think, is so powerful because, if your hand is moving, no matter where your thoughts are, you are still to some degree in that moment. And so writing is a way of focusing our attention. And if we end up with something that then can go forward to other people to help them have that experience, then that kind of completes, that's the goal, I guess, of the writer. That's the fulfillment of the writer. But it starts with what happens to yourself when you're writing. And if that isn't there, if you're not having that experience of savoring, I don't think that the reader will either. It's analogous to me. I understand now when I make a photograph, I'm letting experience flood through. I'm letting my feelings, my vision, my whole being enter into that moment, and then opening the camera, opening the shutter so that the light comes in, the camera receives the image, but it's come from my body, my eye, my hand. It goes through the camera into the image, and then becomes the photograph. And if a viewer looks at a photograph and feels nothing, then my experience of seeing has not been validated. So the photograph that I want to make is one where that page, that image, will carry my sense of the experience, and it's a constant quest. So, yeah, and I think that's great. In fact, that kind of, I don't know, Mick, are we reaching a point where we want to go ahead and wind up here, do you think? If there are other questions, I'm happy to have them, but I appreciate the time people have given to this, and I want to kind of keep within our frame. What do you think we are?
Well, I think we're doing fine on time. If anyone else has a question, we might entertain one or two more.
Okay.
One of the things that I'm always interested in is the life of a poet always begins at a particular point. And you mentioned that you kind of started writing later than, and I really don't like putting a time frame on it, but later on, I'll leave it at that. But when did you first really start enjoying poetry? When did poetry really start to kind of enter into your psyche and become part of your life?
Whoa. Great, big question, great question. I mean, as a kid, I did love reading poems. I read, I had, my parents were both readers, especially my mother, and my mother had a wonderful reading voice and read aloud to me all the time. And we often read poems. So I think, and then I think kids, I mean, we skipped rope to rhymes, and, that sort of poems were part of the tissue of life. But that was different from thinking of writing them. I guess it would be in college, and then especially in grad school, though, that when I began to understand better how to read poems, that poems were a wealth of experience that I could access as a reader. That was the beginning of the opening of a door. But I didn't read much, when I was in high school and college, we didn't read much contemporary work. So the idea of writing poems did seem particularly close to me. Meanwhile, I was interested in fiction and nonfiction, so it was not the genre that poetry didn't seem to offer a lot of possibilities. But you will be amused at this, Mick, because one of the real reasons that I began studying poetry writing is I was teaching in the 80s as a part-time instructor, and I had the opportunity to teach an introductory creative writing course. It was going to include both fiction and poetry. Well, I had the credentials to do fiction. I had some published stories and so on, but poetry, not so much. So I went to my good friend Marilyn Callan and said, hey, can I sit in on your poetry class? I need to know enough so that I could teach this course. And that was when my eyes were opened. That was the class in which I wrote the plumbing store poem and did a number of other poems that really lasted and that I was able to move forward. And I had no idea that what contemporary poets were doing and what an amazing genre poetry was. So that was really when the light went on and I really started writing. But then it's been a steady intensification as I've read more, studied with more poets, and taught, over the years. It's just been a deepening and deepening that I hope will never stop. So good for, I love the fact that any things that happen are a result both of purpose and accident and maybe some ulterior motive. I expected when I taught those first courses, I said, oh yeah, I'm going to love the fiction. I'll just stick in a little poetry because we have to do that. Well, even in those early courses, I was stunned at what my students were writing, what poems they were writing and how much we could do with those. There was so much energy in the poems, much more, it seemed to me, than was in the fiction. So that was another reason then for me to really begin to embrace it.
Well, I think this is a good time for you to wrap things up with your final poem.
All right, okay. Yeah, so this poem is a very recent one, and I actually think it ties together the poems I've read, the poems in the book, and your comments and the things that we've talked about tonight. So the title of the poem is Receiving. Don't take or make a photograph, the instructor says. Receive it. I am thinking about gifts, how we have to be taught to see them, these rocks under our bare feet, gifts of the earth to ground us. We have to be taught to understand that readiness, yours and mine, is all, taught to accept the gift, to open as the flower to the blessed bee, to let the gift bring forth our gifts. As the kind wife folded her endless linen cloth, her kind husband counting his everlasting coins. We have to be taught to say thanks and mean it, taught to praise with our voices and eyes and souls the rich offering that is life, that is the world of wild geese calling, the world that offers itself to our imaginations as the rising light fingers the dune, wakens the water. We have only to raise our faces, stretch out our hands. Well, thank you for the gift of your being with us tonight. Thank you. I thank poetry for its gift. And I hope that we can continue exchanging our gifts of words and feelings. So final thanks to you, Mick. Really enjoyed the session.
You did great tonight, Libby. Thank you so much. I just am honored with having you as a friend and a colleague. Just wonderful, wonderful. And thank you all so much for coming out and celebrating Libby's book and Women's History Month. This has been taped, and as I said before, It will be appearing on Facebook and the Bass Clef Books website. So to everyone, just have a great evening and keep on writing. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. And Mick, can you save that chat for me, please, in case I can't get it?
Yes.
Thanks, everybody. And I don't know if, you can leave this open if anybody did want to stay for a minute or two more to say anything else. I'm glad to do that, or we can sign off right now. It looks like we're mostly signing off.